everyone, and welcome. This is Josh Minks from Lexion. We and Shapr3D are joining together this month to bring you a special webinar. We have Sam Gwilt with us, who will be showing you his Shapr3D to KeyShot process, and we're going to get right into it. So Sam, good sir, take it away.
Hi everyone, thank you very much for having me along, and thank you for the intro. I'm just going to go through a few things about myself so you know who I am and what I sort of do as I go through my Shapr and KeyShot process as well. So my name is Sam. I am an industrial designer and I'm based in London. And I also have an Instagram page called Sam Does Design, where I share a lot of the work that I do in teaching people about industrial design and teaching people about product visualization and things like that. So on my Instagram page here, you can see I've got some KeyShot renders that I like to post, some interior KeyShot renders focusing on materials and things like that. And also I have some examples of my personal projects. So this is a lighting design in collaboration with Gantry. It is a 3D printed design.
Excuse me, Sam. Can you show your screen real quick?
Oh, sorry.
No worries. Thanks a lot.
Screen. There we go.
There it is. We can see it.
Can you tell that I'm new?
You got it, man. Go for it.
Cool. You guys haven't missed out on much. I just brought up this picture of the 3D printed light from Gantry. So this is something that I modeled and rendered a lot in KeyShot before I finally got some actual photos of it from Gantry themselves. So that's now for sale in the US and Canada if you're based there. But I can go back and through and show you the rest of my Instagram page. Like I said, a lot of KeyShot renders, a lot of stuff that I like to show outside of my work. And real quick, I'm going to just take you over to the Precipice Design website, which is the company that I work for. And I'm really excited to announce that we have just we've just been given the go-ahead to say that we have worked with Braun Audio on launching their new range of LE speakers, which are launching for the first time at IFA in Berlin this week. So it's been a hectic day today because today has been launch day. So again, just congratulations to the Precipice team and to the Braun Audio team as well. Okay, enough about me. Let's hop on into Shapr. And I've got a few tips and tricks that I want to show with everyone. I'm going to go full screen here. And the first thing is when you're modeling in Shapr. So let's take this model, for example, which was a fun little project that I put together where I wanted to do an 80s or 90s inspired MacBook with all the latest technology. So you can see down here, we've got a USB-C inputs over here, but because it is 80s and 90s, it's also got a disk drive or a floppy disk drive, depending on the time, over on this side as well. So let's take this model as an example of what we're going to use today to take into KeyShot. And the first tip, I've got 5 tips that I'm going to use in Shapr. I've got 5 tips that I'm going to use in KeyShot, and then at the end, we're going to do a question and answering session. And honestly, guys, that's my favorite part of the time that I do this stuff, because at least with question and answering sessions, I know that it's stuff that you guys are interested in. So I'm going to try and zoom through all of these 5 tips that I've got in both Shapr and KeyShot, and then we'll get into some question and answering sessions at the end. So the first tip that I've got in Shapr is to really imagine the product in the real world. And what we do as industrial designers is we design to constraints. And what those constraints normally are either budget constraints or manufacturing constraints. And things like manufacturing constraints, you can actually build into Shapr3D. And a good example of that is what we call draft angles. And draft angles are essentially on any product that has been injection molded, there will be a draft angle on that part so that when it gets injection molded in the molds, in the tool, it's really easy to push it out of the tool, and you have to be really careful of undercuts and straight edges and things like that. So we model in these angles into the parts so that it lets them be released from the mold easier. Now, a rule of thumb is 3 degrees. That's what we say is a rule of thumb. Some manufacturers, when you start talking to the manufacturers, they can get it down to 2 degrees or 1 degree. But as a rule of thumb, 3 degrees is kind of the going rate for draft angles. And actually, even if you have no plans of taking anything to market and to manufacture, like I have no plans of bringing this Macintosh Air to market, I don't really think I'd enjoy the lawsuit from Apple. Even if you're not thinking about bringing something to the market, it's these little details that will make something look more realistic later on. So your eye is not going to pick up on the fact that these angles aren't straight. But if they were straight, they just wouldn't look right. And something would look wrong because we know and we have been taught over our life on this earth that straight things like this in the real world actually have some slight angles too. So that is tip number 1. Model everything bearing in mind that it will be seen in the real world later on. I mean, that goes without saying for things that you want to manufacture, but also concept designs as well. You're sort of given more free rein in concept designs, but the earlier you can put in the draft angles, the better, because, and believe me, in the past, we've designed things for precipice design, and it looks amazing, and it can fit the electronics inside really well, and it's the smallest thing and the thinnest thing that we can possibly do, but then as soon as you realize, oh, we have to add draft angles and we have to add tolerances and we have to add wall thicknesses, then it starts to change the design. So without getting yourself caught up with that later on, planning for that earlier on is really going to help. Number 2, the tip number 2 for Shapr is using reference planes and using images that you import as well. So I've zoomed out over here and you can see I've actually imported an Apple logo that I downloaded from the internet. And what that basically did was allow me to model more realistically without having to go through and think about, okay, this is 2 times X from here to here, and then 3 times X from here to here. Finding existing solutions on the internet is it's going to save you a lot of time. And you can do that by coming down into add over here, and then add image. So let's say, for example, I wanted to make a reference of the gantry light that I did to maybe make some design changes. I could go ahead and insert that. That is a large file, and place it in there. And then I can scale it and add stuff. And then once that's placed in place there, then I can go ahead and start sketching things over it, and maybe, you know, I change the proportions a little bit based on the proportions of the real world. So tip number 2 is use as much real world data as you can, use as much imported data as you can, because Shapr is great at referencing those types of things. And then you can even go in and scale things to be, like I said, in the real world, you need to make sure it's scalable and fits around all the internal components as well. The next thing that I want to talk about is the labeling system. And you can see here that I have got so many parts because each of these keys is a different part. And I made this keyboard by making one key and then duplicating it across and moving it. And the way that I did that was I can go over to the move tool, duplicate this, and then copy, and then you can see that I've got a copy. So I did that again and again and again until I had all of the keys. But the tip is actually to go through and label all of these layers, because when you import to KeyShot later on, it's really going to help you in understanding what's going on. So to do that, for example, I'm just going to come out of this and name it here. And this is key, I guess that is a T key. So T key. And then that's going to be easy enough. And then I can start to add in folders and stuff as well. So if I wanted to put all of the keys in one folder, I can do that really easily. So I've gone against the tip that I had You can see, so my tip was label all of your layers and make sure you put them into folders. And then, of course, I've gone in here and I haven't listened to my own advice, and it's just, it really starts to add up. Oh, and actually, I forgot that I had this in here. You can see if I go to, where's that gone? There is actually also an image of the keyboard, and that's what I imported, and that is what let me make the keys the right shape and the right size to correspond with the current MacBook Air. Actually, this is a MacBook Pro keyboard, but you get the idea. That is exactly how I got all of the right proportions within the keys. So the next thing that I want to talk about is the biggest part of Shapr when preparing for KeyShot is deciding which file type you want to export at. So let's say, for example, that we're going to export this by pressing the export button up here, and we've got a huge list already. So maybe you just want to show this for a presentation. You can click screenshot, and you can turn off the floor plane, and you can turn off the lines as well to get a semi-rendered model with lighting. When you move around it, the lighting changes as well. So you might just want that for a presentation, just to press go and stick it in if you're talking to a client and trying to get work done as fast as you can, just to give some general consensus of the shape and size and proportions of what you're doing. But if you want to take this into KeyShot, then you have several options in terms of the file type. So you're going to go up here to 3D model, and then I want to make this really clear right now that I am not smart enough to understand all of the ins and the outs of what file type is specifically used for what purpose, and the coding behind it and the math behind it. There are some forums out there that really go into detail that I just don't have the mind for. But that's great for you guys, because I can tell you an overview of the file types based on the experience that I've got in using them in the real world. So Parasolid at the very top is a universal file type that we send to a lot of manufacturers here at Precipice Design. So Parasolid means that you can use it on so many different types of applications, and that's what we tend to use with manufacturers when they don't use the same design software that we do. It's a universal file for them. Something like a step file is also universal, but this is my preferred export type actually for KeyShot. There's a couple that I use a lot, and step is one of them, because with step you can still get all of the curves and all of the edges that you've got in your model. Step is going to keep those, and a few of the model types that we're going to come on to in a minute, you'll understand why that might not be a good thing with those other types. So something like STL, for example, is going to convert the file into lots of little triangles, and it essentially means that I think the T stands for triangle actually, and you can define the resolution of those triangles, but obviously if you increase the number of triangles, it's going to get smoother, but also that's going to increase the file size as well. And then, so that's something to bear in mind if you're transferring from the iPad over to the Mac as well, or over to KeyShot as well. And then finally, object, an OBJ file. That is something that I find is all of the downloadable files that I use online. So I use some external companies like GrabCAD and TurboSquid and CG Trader and companies like that. I find that a lot of those downloads are an OBJ file. And I think the reason for that is because it gives you the opportunity to include a texture within that file itself. So if, for example, I've downloaded an example with curtains, I downloaded some curtains to put in my Eames Lounge render. You might have seen that on my Instagram page when I finally shared that at the start of this session. I downloaded those curtains, and it came and imported into KeyShot, and it already had textures applied to it. And I had to actually go through and take out those textures because I didn't want them in, and I just wanted to make the texture myself in KeyShot itself. And that goes for step file as well, because some versions of step file support different colors, and some versions of step file don't support different versions of colors. And the difference is it's called an AP203 and an AP214. Now, those codes are already more maths than I like to care about when I'm designing. So just know that the bigger number code is the one with colors, and the smaller number code is the one without colors. And that tends to be what I use for exporting. So it's either step or object as well. And IGES, I think I skipped out IGES, but IGES is essentially another universal method of saving files. But again, it's going to split the model into lots of different surfaces that you don't really want so much. So sometimes if I have issues importing step or object, and IGES is the last hope. If I can get the normals or the surfaces to work in IGES, that's fine. But it's going to essentially break up all the surfaces and import them all separately, which is what you don't want. So let's say that we've exported the file. We're just going to go to save and then give it a name and save it. What I tend to do is save it to my desktop by using the Files app on the iPad. Essentially, it's going to go straight to my desktop on the laptop, and then it's going to go straight into KeyShot, which is where I start to model. So I'm running on track for now. I was planning 20 minutes-ish for Shapr. I have really gone through these tips very fast. And if you have any questions, guys, as I'm going through, I'm going to try and pick up on them as I go. I know that I skipped over a lot of modeling stuff. I skipped over a lot of importing and exporting stuff. But like I said, we're going to move on to KeyShot as quick as we can so that we can get to some question and answering at the end. So let's go into KeyShot by pressing escape on this. I'm coming over to KeyShot. Oops, I should have opened the file. So you can tell, guys, that it's been a last-minute spree for the Precipice team, getting everything ready for the Braun speakers launch. So that was just some old files there that I was exporting today for some last-minute renders. So we can see here the laptop within KeyShot already. And I'm just going to quickly go through the layout of KeyShot. So essentially on the left here, we've got library, and everything on the left is essentially things that you will be adding to your scene. You've got the scene itself, and anything on the right is things that you will be editing about that scene later on. So we've got things like materials and environments and lightings and camera setup. And the first thing that I want to talk about is the material graph within KeyShot. And that is going to show how I got some of these more realistic renders, because it's all about adding in specific details that can really add to it. So I'm going to click on, for example, this part down here, and we're going to go into material graph. So the material graph lets you change the properties of each material and add layers that will affect the way that the material reflects light, refracts light, lets light through, and then shines it out the other side. It's a really powerful tool to really make sure that your material is as realistic as possible. Now, what I want to talk about is actually adding in imperfections, because the tip number one in KeyShot is adding imperfections to your model, because that's going to make it look more realistic. So by adding imperfections, what it's telling our eyes is that this thing this thing that's rendered in a computer has similar attributes than to what I see in the real world. And that is going to make it look more realistic, because everything in the real world, even if it is a fresh new product out of the box, it's going to have surface imperfections that, again, we've been trained to see throughout our whole life. And people don't realize that it has those imperfections until you start to look for them. And then you realize that is what's going to make it look more realistic. So what I like to do on most of the materials that I make is add a noise texture node into the bump map. And that doesn't matter what material I'm using, whether it's a glossy material or a matte material. By going right-click and down to textures and including a noise texture like that and putting that into the bump map, it's going to give it really tiny surface imperfections that we associate with realistic things. So for example, if I come into the camera and I press free camera, make sure that I haven't got depth of field on, tick, otherwise we'll go out of focus. If I zoom in right the way down to the thing that I'm looking at, I go to lighting. Let's try performance mode. You can see here already that I've got this bump map, and by changing the shape and the size of the bump map, you can start to understand that it's a plastic that has been injection molded. It has a surface because the surface of the tool had a slight pattern to it as well. So it's adding in all of these little details, exactly like I said with the draft angles, adding in these details that replicate a realistic manufacturing process. That is what's going to make it look more realistic. So on top of that bump map, what I've actually done is change the specular value. And what the specular value does, it works in collaboration with the roughness value as well, but that's going to say how shiny and reflective something is or how matte something is as well. So what I've done is I've made this, this shape in Illustrator. I think I made it, and you can see that it's sort of a black outside edge with a white inside edge, but it's not uniform. It's a wavy edge in there. And I can press C on the keyboard here, and you can see this is the shape that it maps, because I've got it mapped as, how have I got this one mapped actually? I've got it mapped as a planar map. So this is going to be looking straight down onto the key. Essentially what I've told this is anywhere where the value is white, it's going to be more gloss, and it's going to allow light to bounce off it and into the camera, and it's going to look more glossy. And anywhere that the area is darker, it's going to be less glossy and more matte. And the reason why I did this is because if you actually look at keys on a keyboard, you can see that over time, the person using the key is going to wear away the tiny bumps that have been made in the surface from the tool. So by wearing the bumps away, you actually start to make the key look shinier in that area. And it depends on how old the laptop is, or it depends on what type of material the key is made from. But that tends to be the general rule. And you can see that I've actually put that on every single key to make it look slightly more realistic. And actually what I'm going to do is go into to see the keys, because actually I've mapped it all as one material, and all of these materials are linked, and that means I can just add in the specular map and make sure that it goes across all the keys exactly how I wanted it. And the other tip that I'm going to use, this has all been part of tip 1, by the way, which is using realistic materials. The other thing that I'm going to say is, even in Illustrator, when I made this whole sticker, I even made sure to make sure that each one had a slightly different gradient, and also in slightly different places, because what we don't want to do is draw attention to patterns, and we don't want to draw attention to repeating things very close to each other, because the human eye is so good at picking up patterns that we want to try and break up that as much as possible to make this look more organic and to make it look more realistic by adding in those textures as well. So if I go back and press C on the keyboard there to make sure everything is visible, you can see as I move the computer around, there's a different reflectivity on the center of those pieces as well. So, sorry, I just need a glass of water. Sometimes when I talk so long, it takes it out of me. Okay. So the next step is actually looking at the material graph and realizing that, wait, I'm just trying to understand. So the other thing, guys, is I haven't opened this file in a long time. And actually, I'm finding that I'm learning how I did this in real time while you guys are talking as well. So it's interesting for me too. I'm also wondering, I'm sure that I made all of these keys in, oh yeah, no, it's there. So I can press C, yeah. So again, to add realism into the scene, I actually researched what font Apple was using in the late 80s and early 90s, and I researched the font that they used, and I realized that it was design consultancy Frog Design that told them to use this off-centered and lower style, and they used that for quite a while actually in their laptops. So it's all about adding these small elements of detail. And then it was really fun actually because they changed the buttons around quite a lot. They haven't had an Apple button, for example, for a long time, so it was fun to bring that back into it and to change our current icons into the traditional caps lock and shift buttons as well. So actually researching into this project was really fun as well. So the next thing that I want to talk about is modeling in the correct scale, or making sure that we've imported everything in the correct scale, because that is how KeyShot is going to interpret light and shadows and things as well. Light and shadows don't scale very well, so importing them in the correct scale is going to be best for correct lighting. And all I need to do to check that is to go over into my item list and see the actual product itself. And you can see here that we're working in millimeters, and this is roughly the right size. If we extend that and extend that, yep, millimeters there. So that is just a little tip. I know that I spoke for a long time on the materials, but just making sure that the correct size is used in that as well. I have just opened up the questions. I can see I am keeping track slightly in the questions that are being answered. So I'm going to being asked. So I am going to answer this one now. And it's all about the environment of the scene. So we can move over to this side, and you can see that I've got a lot of environments set up for different aspects, and I've given them names. Like I said, you should to remember which one's which as well. So again, what I'm going to say about environment is making sure that you can try and replicate what is going to go on in the real world as much as possible. So in order to do that, what I had to do was learn a lot about photography, learn a lot about product visualization in terms of photography and getting it in camera. And it was things like 3-point lighting or lighting styles that you can use within product design. And you can then try and replicate that in KeyShot by using these nodes up here. So let's copy this, and it's given us a new name. So let's say 3/4 view tutorial. And I essentially started off with a blank HDR, and by adding in more pins, I can move those around. And even if I want to create a certain reflection, I can press set highlight and then make sure that it's lighting the exact bit that I want when I click on the screen there. So why is it important to make things realistic? Well, I know, for example, after researching 3-point lighting and lighting techniques like that, that a lot of photographers use what they call softboxes. And a softbox is going to be, it's essentially something that's going to diffuse the light to be as wide as possible. Now, what that means is it's going to make shadows that aren't so sharp, because the smaller the points are and the brighter they have to become to make the same light, the sharper the shadows are going to get. So making sure that you replicate a softbox is going to give you nice soft shadows when you're rendering out your model as well. And what I've also done is I've modeled in a floor, which is going to give it some slight uplighting, and also a top light as well, because that is how a lot of 3-point photography works. So if I go over into settings, and I can change the lighting environment to be to show what we're actually using. And if I zoom out, you can see that at the very top, we've got our overhead light, and then at the sides, we've got some large soft boxes that are going to give us the nice soft shadows that we like. But what you'll see here is I've also got a really thin light, and that is because I wanted to just highlight the edge here ever so slightly to just pop it off the page, but I didn't want to really highlight the whole thing. I didn't want to add a wash of light across the whole product. So I added in that thin light just to make sure that we had a nice gradient from this point over to this point over here. So essentially what you can do then is save it and make sure that it's locked, so everything is in place and you don't want to change it. And you can go ahead and make new environments that will reflect how you want to show the scene later on as well. What I'm actually going to do, for your information, guys, I have thrown away the 5 points for KeyShot. I'm just going through what I think is useful as I'm heading through as well. And what I think another thing is useful after you set up an environment is making sure that you've got different model sets as well. So different model sets means that you can have different products in different orientations. And you can see that I've got a wooden plank here, so it looks like it's on a table. And then you can combine that with different environments to show off different aspects of it. And what that is then going to let you do is the Studio tab. And this actually is a really important feature, and it is revolutionized the way that I worked in KeyShot. I previously worked in KeyShot 6. They didn't have Studios, but now essentially what Studios does is it lets you combine a camera, an environment, a model set, and an image style as well. So you can change the levels and curves and things like that from the image style, and it lets you combine them. And every time that you then click on that Studio, it's going to change all of the environment to have the same settings that you had when you made that Studio. So I'm actually going to go in. We've lost our for some reason we've lost our floor shadows. Maybe I have to add in another plane. Did I delete that by accident? I don't know. Let's quickly add in a plane. I'm going to make that 3000. Odd. Did anyone see what I did? I don't know. Let's ignore that for now. Let's ignore the fact that we don't have any shadows, because it's in the Studio. Oh, performance mode is on. This is the thing. I've got so much going on. We had the product launch today. I'm trying to present. I'm trying not to lose my voice. So thank you to the savior in the comments. So there we go. That's going to make more sense now. Whew. Again, can you tell that I'm new at this? Okay, let's move on let's carry on the theme of realistic settings within the render to replicate real life. And I'm back on track with the top tips that I've got written down here. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the camera settings that you can use. So as a rule of thumb, what I like to suggest in the camera settings is between 50mm and 80mm for most scenarios. That can change and that can go up to 100, 150mm. But what essentially the millimeters means is the perspective and the angle of perspective of the object in front of you. So I wanted to use this example of the Macintosh as a good example because it's quite boxy and it's easy enough to see the perspective as you move through as well, right? So we can imagine our perspective moving off into the vanishing point at the end, and this way as well as going off that way. So there will be points of the vanishing points. What the millimeter is going to do is change how the camera sees those points. So if I say 80 millimeters, it's going to flatten the image ever so slightly because we just jumped from 60 to 80. And as a rule of thumb, the human eye tends to see around 50 millimeters. So you'll see a lot of portrait lenses on real cameras using a 50 millimeter lens or a 40 millimeter lens. But we tend to like 80 millimeters as well as quite a flattering lens for portraits. If you go much higher, you can start to see that actually, number one, I've got the depth of field turned on. No, do I? It's just taken a while to res up. So you can see actually that the perspective is being lost quite a lot. And if you go much more than 200 millimeters, then you really don't see much of a difference. And honestly, you might as well be in orthographic by that point, which is no perspective whatsoever. But if we want a realistic look, let's say, for example, we want to take it to 60, because that's going to give it some dynamic perspective, but it's not going to be something like 20, where it starts to look really fish-eyed, and you can get some really crazy looks. So for product photography, when you want it to look more realistic, stick to something between 50 and 80 millimeters. So the next thing to think about is all camera lenses, when you use them, are going to have what's called depth of field. Now, what depth of field means is it's going to blur some certain areas, and then it was going to slowly come into focus, and then it's going to blur things past that point as well. So for example, let's say we're going to have an f-stop of 1, which means that there will be just a tiny sliver of things that are in focus. And you can see here that I've got the right mouse button in focus, and maybe a couple of the directional arrows in focus as well. But as the laptop moves further back, everything else becomes unfocused. And then if I go up to something like 16, and let's switch over to geometry view as well, because that's going to let us help see where we are. You can see that the planes of focus are further away from each other compared to 1. If I just show you that as well, they are very close to each other, which means just that sliver is in focus. And then 16 means all of that area is going to be in focus. And it just means that this over here, this top corner, is going to be out of focus, but only a little bit. Now, the reason why I say all this is because if you want to replicate what's going on in a camera, then you need to replicate that in KeyShot as well. So essentially, what I would suggest is having a little bit of depth of field, even if you want everything to be in focus. Just adding in just a tiny little bit is going to make it look more realistic. Something else that's going to make it look more realistic as well is something called, if we go over to the image tab, Chromatic Aberration, which is going to replicate what we find in cameras. And it essentially means it's a misalignment of the color, and it's really difficult to tell when you're this close, when you're this far away on the render. But we can try and make this a little bit bigger. Let's see if we can see it happening. You can see a little bit of alignment issues, which happens in cameras all the time. And actually, you might think that adding in those misalignments of the colors would make it look bad, but actually, again, we have learned to understand that as a realistic thing from high quality photos. So adding in just a small amount, maybe not, maybe not 1, that might be a little bit too much, but adding in just a little bit is really going to add to the realism. So moving on to some tips in terms of positioning and in terms of the format of the renders that you can make. So I've spoken a little bit about the cameras. Now I want to talk about where you can put the cameras in order to get some good renders. So we want to think about the rules that you can use within photography. We want to bring those rules into KeyShot as well. And that is going to mean using things like rule of thirds and symmetry. And by making sure that we have you know, we are highlighting the different elements that we want to see by generating intrigue. So for example, I purposely made sure the Apple logo in this render was directly in the center of the screen. But what that also meant was I could run the Macintosh Air further off the screen, and it's going to give us something of a rule of thirds effect where we are drawn more to things that aren't symmetrical, or things that aren't meant to be symmetrical. We are drawn to it if they are symmetrical. So you can really play with that as well. So make sure that you read up on camera techniques and photography techniques if you want to make realistic renders too. Okay, the last thing that I want to talk about real quick, I should have picked up on it earlier on, but it is the rule of it's the inverse square law. Now, this again is some more math I don't really like to do, but it's important when lighting your render to make sure that you are doing things realistically by essentially the distance of the light from the object is going to directly affect how that object is lit. So something that's really far away and really bright, like our sun, is going to light the product evenly, and it's going to light it the same, whether the closest thing is, it's going to light it the same as the closest point as it is the far away point. But if you have let's say you have a plane really close up to your model, let's say here, and you're pushing light this way, this area of the model is going to be extremely bright, whereas this one, because the distance between here and here is bigger than the distance between here and the plane, this one over here is going to be really dim. So I just wanted to pick up on that and say that's why a HDR is really useful, because you can make sure that the render is lit from a nice far away zone, which is going to help with rendering it uniformly. So I didn't count off the KeyShot top 5 list, and I took a bit of a detour, but I think I've covered everything that I want to cover. I know that some people I can see in the comments are talking about going back into Shapr, which I'm more than happy about doing. I can answer some questions about Shapr if you'd like me to go back in there. So with about 15 minutes left, if you have any questions, then let me know. So straight off the bat, I've got one here. The orange glow coming from the screen. Actually, I can show you the orange glow coming from the screen, because that's a cool thing that I thought in my nerdy self, I thought was pretty cool. So actually it is the desktop wallpaper that I saw everyone use, and I really like this desktop because it has really blue colors and orange colors and complementary colors. And what I have done is set that up as a multi-material. So what that means is I can click through and change the material, and I've just got it set up as colors. And if I come over to labels, you can see my label properties here, and you can see that I've got it set to emissive. So what that is essentially going to do is turn this into a light that is going to reflect light over and reflect it from our areas that are more reflective, like I said earlier on. So adding in those multi-materials is really going to help with that as well. Another tip that I had is also, if I go back, go this, make sure that the field is off. There's also this, which is called, I don't know how well this is going to translate onto everyone's screen. I'm going to go back into performance mode, and don't let me forget that I went into performance mode. So this sort of banding of colors, which you see when you take photographs of screens, this is actually what's called moire or moire. I have no idea how to pronounce it, but all I did to get this effect in KeyShot was I took a picture of my own screen and I just photoshopped that moire effect over this hello image that I had downloaded. And by having it baked into the image, it means that I can get a really realistic look by, again, adding in imperfections that we don't necessarily like to see in photos, but without them makes it look a lot less real. So by adding in the emissive screen to give the keys some reflective blue, because this is quite a blue color, and then also adding in the moire in this diffuse screen or this plastic screen. That is what's going to add the detail as well. The environment of the top-down shot, I'm going to go in quickly. We're going to go into lighting, product, I think it was on, lighting environment. We're going to show this, and then camera, boom. Let's see. All this is a blue background image because I wanted the shadows to have a blue tinge to them. And then just a couple of pin lights that we're going to, one, light the scene uniformly with this large one. Like I said, the larger the light, the softer the shadows are going to be. And then two, a really bright, small light, because that is what's going to give me the hard shadow that I really like the look of here. And by having a hard shadow, you can then really see the emissive light underneath. So that's there. I haven't actually added any bloom effects into this. But that is another great way of adding some more realistic elements to it. So adding in a bloom effect would be cool as well. People are asking me to model or do some more modeling in Shapr. I've actually done a webinar in Shapr already, so you can go over to their YouTube channel and check that out. If you want to see me modeling in more detail, I know that I skipped over a lot of Shapr stuff today. I did more exporting and best practices, not necessarily Shapr. So you can go over to the YouTube channel, the Shapr YouTube channel, where I already modeled. Actually, last time it was in collaboration with Procreate, and I did some lighting design. So yeah, check that out if you want to see some more modeling. But if you've got any questions, I can go through that too. Let me just see, I'm scrolling through real quick. Tips for rendering dark, tips for rendering in dark environments to reduce noise. So that is always tricky to get rid of noise within KeyShot. I do know that KeyShot 9, they have announced that there is a denoiser based on GPU rendering, which I am really excited to try out. I think I'm going to be able to try some beta software soon for that, and I'm going to report back on my YouTube channel as soon as I'm allowed to do that. So go and follow my YouTube channel if you want to check that out too. It's Sam Does Design. So yeah, to try and get rid of noise, it's all about setting up the sample rate to be as high as possible. So let's say, for example, I'm going to go to render this, and let's just say find desktop. The thing to note first is the smaller you make your render, so the resolution here, the faster it's going to render, and the bigger you need to render, the slower it's going to render. That's how it's going to work. I normally just export in JPEG, but if I know I'm going to do a lot of photoshopping after the fact, I can export it in TIFF for the 2-bit, because that is going to keep all of the black levels and all of the highlights white levels, and not going to crunch those and turn those into just black and white values. It's going to give me a lot more data in the highlights and shadows that I can render out after. But I normally render in JPEG. And what you're going to do, or what I tend to do, is not render by maximum time. I don't tend to go for custom control. I just tend to go for these samples. And by adding in as many samples as you can, that is what is going to bring down the noise in your render. The only downside is to that the render isn't going to finish until it has reached those sample numbers, but you can always pause it and save it wherever the render is once you get to a point that you like. So if, for example, if you get to 1,000 samples and you think, you know what, it looks pretty good, then you can just always exit the render and save it to wherever you wanted to save it. But I think a lot of Photoshop work can come out at the other side and can actually save time over rendering, say, 4,000 samples in KeyShot. Can we use KeyShot? Hey, how you doing?
Good. There was a question on your setup, how you're able to use Shapr how you're showing it on the screen,
Oh yeah,
and just maybe you can mention in general what laptop or
sure. Yeah,
computer
that's
you're
cool.
using, maybe some specs.
Yeah, so I'm currently running on a MacBook Pro, and what I'm going to do is, what do I need? QuickTime. I'm bad at spelling. QuickTime. Okay, I'll start from the top. I'm running an iPad, a MacBook Pro, and an iPad Pro. The MacBook is, I think, 2018, a 13-inch, and the specs have been upgraded a little bit. I think it's a work laptop, so I don't know. I was given this one 8 gigabytes of memory. So that's what I use as my everyday driver now. The way that I've got my iPad to show up on the screen is through QuickTime, and you can go to, when you launch QuickTime and you've got your iPad connected using a USB cable, you can go to new movie recording, and then you can automatically set, for example, the camera is iPad down here. So that's in real time, which I think is really cool. And that's great as well, because then as soon as I save something on the iPad, for example, I've just done some step stuff for some mock-ups. So I saved it to, I saved the step file to my desktop using the Files app, and then it appeared here straight away. So that's really, I really enjoy using Apple products in that sense. Sometimes I have to switch over to some other modeling softwares that isn't supported by Apple, and I don't mind doing that at all, but sometimes I have to. So I use Boot Camp in that case to switch over to the other ones that Apple don't support. Cool, I hope that answers the question.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Cool.
Thank you.
No problem. This other question is about playing videos. So you can import, instead of importing a sticker or a label, let me find one that can see it. Instead of importing a sticker, a decal label, you can actually tell it to import video. And if you have all your frames saved, you can do it that way. And then once you have the animation, where am I? Animation, oh, of course, it's A. Once you have the animation tab, and you can, I think it's down there. Then you can actually play, I think I was singing MacBook's praises, but I think it's dropped off the bottom and it won't let me pull it back. So yeah, once you have the animation and press play, you can export the render to show the screen playing the video as well. Yeah. Cool. I mean, we've got maybe like 7 minutes left, guys. If you have any more questions, I'm quickly going through. I've done the bloom effects one, dark environments. Yeah, I think I've done that. I've suggested to go and look at my modeling on the Shapr YouTube channel. Would it be easier to add in the depth of field afterwards in Photoshop instead of rendering it in KeyShot? That is possible. What you can do when you press render and you go to the output settings, you can also, let me remember which one it is, you can also tick the depth map. So that means that you don't have to render depth of field in KeyShot whatsoever, but then you can go into Photoshop, add in your JPEG of the or whatever file you've saved it as, and add in the depth map into that same Photoshop file. And you can tell Photoshop to blur out the areas that the depth map tells it to. So you can do it after KeyShot. You can do that for videos as well. What I would say is I much prefer to do everything in KeyShot itself instead of going in and fixing it in post. So for example, the Brawn project that I'm now allowed to talk about, because we launched today, we had to render maybe 200 or 250 views of 3 products. They've launched 3 products in a black variant and a white variant. And if I had to go through and Photoshop every single one of those outputs, then that's not a fun job. So I would much prefer to set it all up in KeyShot and then I can just press go over the weekend and know that on Monday morning, the big PC tower that we've got is rendered them all without me even needing to open Photoshop to fix them up. But yes, it is possible to do that if you're strapped for time and have time to Photoshop later on. Let's see. Any more questions? People reminded me that I've gone into performance mode. Thank you, guys. Cool. So, guys, if there are no more questions, let me see. Great session. Thank you so much for joining in. It means a lot. I hope you enjoyed it, guys. Okay, a few questions at the bottom I'm looking at now. The image on the keys, I was added as a bump. The image on the keys are a decal that I had as one large decal that I've used to map it on as one. They're all, the materials are linked together. So if I add it to one material as a planar, it's going to add them to them all. And the same with the specular, which is going to let me have a glossier section in there as well. What should I keep in mind when doing ID modeling for a computer? Made one on the website. Yeah, so like I said, all the draft angles, make sure you can fit the components in, make sure you can bring it into realistic proportions as soon as you can in the design process. That's going to really help you out later on. Any tips for an environment to match a photo when superimposing? Adding a photo as the background. Yes, so adding in a photo as a background is great. You can do that by going into environment and backplate image. So what I would suggest for compositing images is a really direct light source is going to really help you out, because you can really start to understand where that light source is coming from, right? But if you have an overcast day as your backplate image and the shadows are really soft in the image, it's really difficult actually to light that because it's the small things that we don't pick up on that we can never get right. So I would suggest using a photo that has got some really sharp shadows in there as well. Can I share any of the Braun images? You can go to precipicedesign.com or you can go to Precipice Design on Twitter and Instagram. We're finally allowed to say it. We have some movies that we've posted to our social media channels that are using actually a lot of KeyShot renders. So thanks KeyShot for letting us do that so easily. Cool. Which KeyShot do I use? I'm on KeyShot 8. Excited to try KeyShot 9. And one last question, the 3/4 environment, can you show us how to create a thin light? Yes, so if I go over to the thin light and I go over to the HDR editor, you can see that I've got I've added it in. I've gone to rectangular because it needs to be a rectangular light because I want to replicate what the photographers are doing. And then in the size, I can actually just change the X height and the Y height. Because I've made it so thin, I need to make it quite bright, so that is why I have made it brighter there. The other settings you can use just to essentially change where it's positioned in the HDRI, but I hope that answers the question. And I think we are coming to the end of the session. A couple of hiccups from my side. I didn't even share my screen, but I hope you guys have enjoyed this collaboration with Shapr and KeyShot. And just thank you so much, guys, for having me on. You can find me at Sam Does Design on Instagram and YouTube, where I do a lot of tutorial videos like this as well. So come over and suggest videos that you'd like to see. And thanks, guys, from KeyShot and Shapr, if you'd like to say any more words, or what's the plan to end this thing?
Yeah, thanks, Sam. That was excellent. Thanks for the tips. Incredible to see the process. And yeah, if you guys definitely check out Sam's Instagram, YouTube channels, Sam Does Design. Check out Shapr at Shapr3D.com and their YouTube channel as well for some really great tutorials. You can find us on YouTube at KeyShot3D, and we'll be posting this webinar there as well very soon. So look out for that, and we'll send out a notification to everyone who registered for that. And we will see you next time. Thanks again, Sam.
Thank you so much. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.